Well, welcome. Today we're celebrating a remarkable milestone, which is the 40th anniversary of the University of Minnesota's Center for Transportation Studies. So over the past 4 decades, CTS has brought together researchers, practitioners, and policymakers to improve how people and goods move across Minnesota and beyond. So joining me today are 3 leaders who have each shaped CTS's story. So Kyle Shelton, our current director, Laurie McGinnis, who led the center from 2010 to 2021, and Robert Johns, who served as director from 2001 to 2009. So our theme for this anniversary, driving innovation, accelerating discovery, and fueling talent, captures the spirit of CTS across the decades. But let's begin with a look back at how it all began. So as we mark this 40-year milestone, what comes to mind for each of you when you think about how CTS has evolved since its early days? And Bob, let's start with you.
I'm the oldest. The early days of CTS were sort of all about survival. Dick Braun, the first director, hired me in 1988, and he brought, when he came to the university with him, a lot of funding, $2.7 million of oil overcharge funds, and then a year later another $2 million, which was great, but the catch was that it had to be spent in 4 years. So our challenge was to set up programs to produce quality products, to have good connection with our stakeholders, be valued during these 4 years, so by the time they are over, we had attracted some kind of base funding, which is sort of nerve-wracking.
Right, yes.
But we did ultimately get written into some legislation and achieve that challenge.
So survival mode marked the early part of your tenure at the center. So how did you move beyond that and grow the role of the center?
Well, we really involved a lot of the stakeholder groups, and we designed a committee structure, a research council structure, to really have a lot of involvement. People really we discovered people really want to be connected to the university. So we experimented with several different approaches, and I think helped build that image and ultimately had that name that allowed some legislative language to go through.
Great. Laurie, how about for you?
Well, I thought it would be a good time, given that Bob was talking about the early years, to give credit here for something that they established as a foundational philosophy about CTS, which was that they did not want to be perceived inside the university as competing with departments. So CTS and Bob and Dick, with their leadership, made the determination that they would not hire individual faculty. They wanted to serve as a resource to faculty who already had appointments in departments. And that turned out to be a really good model for CTS, which has been fruitful and successful all through time. So I would hope that's one of the things that continues. When needed, if there was a special expertise needed, there would be a joint appointment or something so that there could be access to that special expertise. And then the CTS staff would provide the research management, the convening, the educational support, but be that service and be the partner of the faculty and their department. And I think that model served CTS very well. And I don't know, Bob, if you want to add anything to how you came up with that great idea?
Well, that's a good point, Laurie. We did look at other centers around the country and how they were structured and also how they were funded. And part of our mission challenge, was to define what kind of issues we would deal with. And I think on the first day I said to Dick, if we're going to be called the Center for Transportation Studies, we really don't belong in civil engineering. And not that civil engineering doesn't do great research, it still does, but we didn't want to be bounded by that. It came home in an executive committee meeting where we had used an RFP process to select projects for our next year's research. We had a review panel with MnDOT and private sector senior faculty. We brought in this program of projects to recommend, thinking that the executive committee, which included deans, MnDOT commissioner, private sector leaders, they would bless the process. But instead, we were in the middle of an argument between the dean of the Institute of Technology and the Humphrey Institute dean, because at that time, the Institute of Technology, which is where civil engineering resided, they wanted all of our research to be performed by their faculty. The dean of the Humphrey Institute made the point, the issues facing transportation are more policy-oriented than ever. We need to have social sciences and so on. So that was pretty awkward. And Dick realized what I was talking about, and we eventually moved up to report to the vice president for research and the provost at a high level that could reach across the university.
Right. Well, it might have been bumpy at the beginning, but I would argue that that notion of the intersection of engineering and technology and policy and planning has really become a sweet spot for the University of Minnesota. So it can be somewhat unique among university transportation centers around the country in that we're looking at what are the planning and policy implications when we're looking at a new technology, for example. So I think that maybe it started out rocky, but I feel like we play much better together these days, and I think that has really become one of the strengths of the center. So, yeah. Kyle, or Laurie, did you have something else?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
I would like to talk about the evolution that was most at the forefront during my time as director, which was a transition from sponsored designated research to competitive research. So the earmarks that Minnesota had benefited from largely went away, and federal level competition became more competitive. But also, the Minnesota DOT decided to open up their RFP to other universities in other states. And that was a challenge that caught us a little unexpected, I'll say, but we, I think, rallied wonderfully. And one of the reasons that we were able to navigate that so well is the breadth and depth of researchers that the University of Minnesota has to offer in transportation. And one of my favorite anecdotes to share is that when people would ask me to describe what I do, I said, well, I have this great job of brokering between people who can do research and people who have research needs. And you wouldn't believe the number of topics that contribute to transportation. And I said, and my example was, would you believe that we need to pay attention to roadside grasses and what can survive a Minnesota winter? And everybody would go, aha, of course. But most people don't think of that as a transportation issue. Right. And I think that's just indicative of the breadth and depth that CTS had to offer. So as we navigated this transition to more competitive-based funding, we learned to develop proposals. We learned to put together multidisciplinary teams because single PI research was kind of a thing of the past. They wanted all these disciplines to contribute to the solutions. And as I mentioned, CTS was well positioned to move into that.
Great.
Yeah. Well, and you reacted extremely well because those were challenging times.
Yes, they were.
I mean, the federal funds, there's always uncertainty there, but the state partnership with MnDOT changed dramatically there, and it was disappointing to me looking at it from afar.
And I think one thing that I would say to that note, but also that ties in really well with our ongoing partnerships, like one of the things that I have learned and been delighted to build on is the strengths of those partnerships and the foundation that you all and all of the staff across the years have helped to build. And I think that has allowed us to, weather those different decisions from agency partners, state, local, regional, federal, and say, how do we shift? How do we become as flexible and remain as competitive as possible? And I know we'll come back multiple times to the interdisciplinarity side of things, but I think, Gina, your point about the combination from the engineering and the policy perspective, but then one of the things we've been working on more recently is what is this broadest tent of transportation and what is the transportation enterprise at the university? What can it contain, and how do we work with somebody, for example, from public health who maybe doesn't think of themselves as a transportation researcher or scholar by any means, but the work they're doing on access to pharmacies dovetails incredibly nicely with the Accessibility Observatory. And I think that's part of being able to recognize where our strengths as our researchers lie, where the things you all talked about with the structure of CTS itself is sort of, I call us the two-way hub, right? Like what you were talking about, Laurie, between people with questions and people who have a desire to find those answers and working collectively across those realms. And that interestingly goes back and forth between researchers and the agencies, right? Like sometimes the researchers are coming with the questions and sometimes they're looking just to respond to the questions coming from them. Coming from the agencies. And I think being able to really recognize and change with those pattern, like of who's here and what work they're doing, and then really staying in touch with our state partners and saying, okay, here's how this is going to shift. How do we best address that? And think about bringing to the fore some of the questions that we've had, because that's one of the solutions that we've brought to the MnDOT team is to say, okay, here are some questions that come from the University of Minnesota that we still think would be worthwhile to explore, and how do we build that relationship and that path, which I think has been a useful evolution in that space too.
Great. So Laurie and Bob, you both have shared already the roles that you've played, or the leadership you've shown during important transition and times of growth. But what moments or accomplishments stand out from you, for you most from your years of being director? Laurie, you want to start?
I'll do that. For me, the one that came to mind easily was creating the MnCav program. And we were just in the right place at the right time. The Center for Transportation Studies had a 30-year history of advancing and innovating in intelligent transportation systems. So there was so much happening on the technology side. It was well ahead of the policy, the regulation, the systems that it needed for full deployment. And our key partner, MnDOT, and some other local partners, the McKnight Foundation, for example, was a great partner with us at that stage of our development. They wanted CTS to convene a symposium that would allow Minnesota, the key stakeholders, to create a vision around what should connected and automated vehicles look like in Minnesota. How do we get it deployed to the extent that benefits the most people here in Minnesota? So we were able to convene a 100-person workshop, Gina at my right hand. It was so much fun. And a product was produced from that, which included a vision and some action plans. And from those action plans, of course, the University of Minnesota and CTS, we were tasked with the right research and the right way to address the testing and things like that would help Minnesota. And what Gina and I were able to do was create an amazing team of private sector, public sector, foundation, University of Minnesota funding, and we were able to acquire a connected and automated vehicle that launched the Minnesota CAV program.
And that's been so timely. I mean, even just in recent news with Waymo coming in and our continued work in partnership with the Governor's Advisory Committee on connected and autonomous vehicles, it's been so nice to be able to say, look at, again, this, I'm going to use the word foundation a lot of times probably today, but having the foresight and the leadership from the university to say this is a space that we should be thinking about and working on. It's been not quite 10 years from the kernels of that time, right? But it's a good indication of if you start thinking about a topic early on and marshaling resources and questions and teams that can help answer them and bring other partners along. Obviously, we're not leading all of the state's actions, but being able to say, here's the work that we can do, or here are the questions that we can help answer, the conversations we can help convene. That's borne fruit just in these last couple weeks as we've started to say as a state, how are we dealing with this? And a lot of that work that you guys started with that conversation, I'm sure, has direct through lines to the documents being produced by that committee these days.
Love to hear that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. I mean, one of my favorite things to do is to go back and look at documents to see, okay, have we done what was suggested or what was proposed? And it's always gratifying to go back and be able to say, yes, we've made progress in this space, and I think we can point to ideas and actions that have come out of events that were things that we've convened, and that workshop is a great example of that. So Bob, how about for you? What stands out?
I was just thinking you're going to have that vehicle drive you home in the snow.
Why hadn't I thought of that?
Well, this is building on Laurie's earlier words about interdisciplinary approaches. The big accomplishment that made an impact on me was our Transportation and Regional Growth Study. before that, we were funding individual projects, individual researchers, projects often in the range of $50,000 through that RFP process. But there was demand. It became obvious that on some of our bigger issues facing the region, we need more interdisciplinary approaches. So we teamed with MnDOT, and it actually was driven a bit by the MnDOT commissioner at the time, Jim Den, who was asking questions, particularly around 35W rebuilding. He had smart growth advocates. He wanted to know more about the economics of transportation, policy issues. So we assembled a team of engineering, economics, geography, public affairs. In our proposal, we put funding for an aggressive outreach program, which led to your hiring.
Thank you.
Yes, and we had a program management team where we brought other people into the funding process, the Local Road Research Board, as well as MnDOT. The Met Council, although they didn't have funds to support the research, they were tremendously interested, and we're on that program management team, and we did affect some of their policies with our research. So that was a real accomplishment, and it set a model that we use in the subsequent Access to Destination study, which the Observatory has always already been mentioned. You guys can talk more about that, but we are also well positioned to respond to this inquiry from the American Institute of Architects on transportation and community design. And again, we assembled 6 to 8 researchers from multiple disciplines, did this national study that they used to go through their chapters in all their regions to try to encourage urban designers to incorporate transportation strategies. So those weren't only great accomplishments for me, they were very enjoyable to coordinate.
Well, and it was that whole connection between transportation and land use really wasn't as prominent or wasn't discussed. And I feel like that study and that work was a real launching point for that, in addition to just access to destinations, but for conversations between sort of the planning side and the engineering side of agencies. So it was, I think it was really groundbreaking in that sense as well. I think the other piece that was really interesting about that is that we actually hired a writer to kind of synthesize, it was either 13 or 16 research reports to really try to tell the story through those different reports about what was learned. And I think that that document, again, still relevant to how we think about transportation today. So
I think that also goes to the unique structure of what CTS is and who the teams have always been as well, because one of the challenges that academic units often face is here I'm speaking to my audience, right? I'm a civil engineer, here's my paper, you all understand the mathematical equations and the significance of this just by looking at that. And way too often, that message is missed when it moves to an agency or to even more likely to be missed moving to a public stakeholder who's not working in an agency, right? And so we lose sort of the weight and the dynamic and the impact of that work. And I think one of the things that certainly has been exciting for me is, again, I'm going to keep talking about building on the work that's been here for 40 years, is having those teams in communications and program management, in education and workforce, where we can say, this is why this research matters, right? It's not just a product of Professor A has done this work. Isn't that wonderful? Let's make sure it continues to feed into the academic cycle, which is important in and of itself, but it's also let's take that out and make sure MnDOT sees that, or City of Minneapolis sees it, or a northern Minnesota city sees it, or just John Skivlin and I, our communication director, were talking about salt practices for people in their homes today, right? Where it's sort of like, we can talk about it in a really esoteric academic way, or we can figure out how do we use our reach and our communications tools and our whole team to say, this is why this matters to somebody today in our very icy road home.
Right. Well, and that's exactly why Gina's question was so hard, because how do you pick just one thing?
Right.
CTS has had such a long-standing focus on impacts, and how do we get this new knowledge to the people who can use it? So it was hard to pick one,
Yes.
but I had to.
Yeah. Well, you'll get to add another one with
I
my
will
next
later.
question.
All right. Well,
Yes. So, yes.
well, can I?
Actually, I wanted to insert
yeah,
that.
go ahead.
I wanted to talk about mine, if you're okay with that.
Go ahead. Well, I was just going to, before shifting to
Okay.
just mention that the regional growth study also was a model for how we made hiring decisions. So we knew that would be 2 or 3 years of work, and then we wanted outreach, so that was enough to say, we need a vacancy here, we need to hire, and we hired Gina. But the assumption was you would help build on
Yes.
that, attract additional funding, and we built a staff that way. We took risks, not knowing how long we could keep someone employed,
Right.
but our growth allowed us to keep people employed.
Well, you kept me employed for 28 years. So
I
far,
did, and
Bob,
look where
so
you are
that's
now.
right. So, Laurie.
Well, as we've been discussing, the Transportation and Regional Growth Project and Access to Destinations Project were just so advanced for CTS, and in terms of building new knowledge, did incredible things. They also produced a tool, and we could see that the tool had great potential for being impactful, not just in Minnesota, but nationally and to others as well. So we took advantage of the opportunity to create the Accessibility Observatory, and with it came some staff. It also meant one of those early organizational challenges that I struggled with to come to the right decision, because it was a challenge that said move away from that philosophy that had been created at the beginning. It meant I would have to decide to bring researchers and house them in CTS. And there were some risks with that because it meant long-term funding needed to be secured. So I wrestled with that. I wouldn't say it was easy, but got great advice from external stakeholders, internal partners, et cetera, and we decided it was the right thing to do. So we housed the Accessibility Observatory here and had a lot of fun. I think that is, when I think about fun in my job, that one included it because it had the technology, the outreach, the education, everything. And so much praise to MnDOT on this one because they supported the 2 studies that led to this work and this tool, but they also then took the lead for us in creating a state pooled fund project, which brought many stakeholders from around the country to the table with us with money. And from that, the annual report for Access was created. It now helps agencies and private sector entities as well, determine the ease with which people can get to the valued destinations. If they want to know how to get to the nearest clinic, they can learn that as well. And so it's, I think, just been an amazing tool with now a very large group of stakeholders and funders that support it.
And we're currently recruiting for round 3, so feel free to reach out to those.
I'd be happy to.
It is a really great. Yeah, there you go. It is a really great program, and it's one of the examples that I use of sort of the baseline level of excellence and work that we have at CTS, and where we're able to say, in my previous work, I did a lot of work in housing, and so I think about it as a tax increment finance opportunity, where it's sort of like, this is what we're already doing. Here are all the things that we are going to continue to do really well. We don't have to touch those. We can think about them critically and improve them, but generally, we're going to just keep the train on the tracks. And then with things like the Accessibility Observatory, our local technical assistance program, MinCab, there are many examples, which is also just a testament to the range of stuff we're working on. But we have these really big opportunities to say, what's the next big challenge or the next big question that we want to tackle or the next big project that we take on. And I think the Accessibility Observatory team is really positioned to keep doing a lot of that, kind of cycling back, thinking to that, the roots of it with the studies that you guys are mentioning, having another moment of, okay, if access metrics are now being seen and brought into decision making at a whole nother level, how does this national database and this great team that we have continue to position ourselves to keep pushing that?
Well, I'm glad to hear that it's still in favor.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, what I loved about it, once you got the state pooled funding going, then doing an annual measurement
Exactly.
countered or complemented what Texas Transportation Institute used to do with congestion measures. I don't know if they still do that.
They still do, yeah. Yeah.
So
Lots
they come
of
out
stuff
with
in
these
conversation with each other. Yeah.
rankings. Here's the most congested cities. But that doesn't really tell you much.
Exactly.
Accessibility tells you much more. So I love that outcome.
So Bob, one of the things that I know you have the most experience with was around commercialization of a technology and how, again, the development of something here at the university led to a commercial product, and that does have real impacts even today. So just wondered if you'd like to share a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, there was always that drive, and Kyle's mentioned it now, to have things make a difference. That's not just feeding journal papers, that the research produces something that is an impact. The commercialization is a really tough thing to accomplish. But early in CTS existence, we had this innovation produced by Panos Michailopoulos, a professor in civil engineering, who was using machine vision to do traffic monitoring, traffic counting, classification, detection, that had advantages over the loops that are embedded in the pavement. And we used some of that oil overcharge funding to help him take that to a level where it could be considered for commercialization. The university was just beginning the process of how to capture innovations from faculty that might lead to a patent and even some royalties that would come back to the university. This was one of the early successful ones. This product is called Autoscope, and a company was formed called Image Sensing Systems, which I think is still successful. And it did produce significant royalties that not only benefited the university, it benefited CTS. So it was a great story of research that can make an impact.
Kyle, how about from your perspective, what is an example of how CTS has been able to have been able to turn ideas into impact?
Yeah, I think one thing I would build on from the Autoscope example that Bob's talking on a little bit before I give a more concrete example as well is the university, I think, has, like many universities, continued to get better with technology commercialization and continue to prioritize it. And I think it's something we've seen, especially in the last decade, be a high level of focus for a lot of universities. And I think the University of Minnesota is really, again, building from a lot of that previous experience, really focusing on that and thinking about how do we double down on those areas of entrepreneurship and economic strengths that the state has, and how can the university be the hub for that. And I think that's another place where there's probably too often a disconnect for not all researchers think, oh, this technology that I'm working on could be commercialized necessarily, right? There are some people who are acclimated to that idea and who work really diligently to turn a lot of their ideas into that. And I think more and more folks are realizing, okay, if there's a piece that I'm working on and I can turn it into something that can get picked up by an industry member, that's also a way to see the impact of that research go. And so I think there's just, it's really fun to see a lot of the work that people do either turn into individual patents and inventions or even get spun off into more companies, which we're seeing more of as well. And so the continued evolution of how do we work with a faculty member and industry partners, or faculty members who become industry partners in part-time capacities, and say, hey, how do we keep talking about that technology as well? And
you're right that faculty, not all faculty are in favor of it, because they can see it as disrupting their efforts to create new knowledge that's ultimately shown in peer-reviewed papers.
Yeah.
So that coordination, facilitation is really important.
Yeah, and I think that's just been, I don't know if you all have experiences with this as well, but I think it's that transition between sort of traditional academic approaches and industry practices, for lack of a better term, I feel like has also been a back and forth for universities for a very long time, probably preceding all of us as directors, right? Universities trying to figure out how to be an economic driver beyond, oh, we're a university and we have a lot of people doing things here, right? And I think that has just become more apparently critical to our missions as institutions to say, yes, we're preparing students in all of these fields and in all of these ways, and we are also actively building the economy and building the future that we're working towards, right? And universities themselves are evolving. I think CTS has been a part of that, trying to understand how to help researchers navigate that, how to position ourselves with partners to say, yeah, we could probably find that answer in a less academic way than we might typically. How do we do that in a year? How do we do that in 6 months? While also maintaining, here are some of those foundational basic things that we want to work on.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have another example you wanted to share?
Oh, I think one thing, just sort of thinking about, we often talk about innovation in terms of technology, and again, I think I'm gonna jump back to what Gina shared about like the multiple disciplines and the multiple focuses and partners that we have at the university, to also think about innovations and programs. And that's something, again, that I feel like CTS, I often say we contain multitudes, right? And there are times where I'm like, I didn't even know that the AirTap program was doing that great. Similarly, our partners across the university, there are just so many great organizations and institutions and researchers doing a range of things. One of the programmatic innovations that has happened in the last couple of years that I've been really excited about is something called the Empowering Small Minnesota Communities Program. And that's a partnership that CTS is involved with the Regional Sustainable Development Partnership from Extension, the Minnesota Design Center, CURA, the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs, and the Humphrey School. That's the first time we said school, I think, and not institute. So you can tell what time frame we're in now.
Yeah.
And that was legislatively funded in the 2023 session, and the connection and kind of the innovation on the policy side that we were trying to address was a lot of small Minnesota cities have huge infrastructure needs, not just in transportation, but in stormwater and wastewater, in energy production, in community development, economic development. And the university has a range of folks who can help communities build on those assets and strengths and address their weaknesses and think about how we can support them. And this structure has been, how do we bring university time and resources to those communities, but have them kind of drive that agenda and say, here are the projects we want to be working on, and here are the questions that we have. So in much the same way that we have a structure of, hey, MnDOT, what are the questions you have? The ESMC program has allowed us to kind of bring proposals in from communities across the state. They all have to be less than 15,000 residents, and have them say, we're working on this project. We would love some time and some support on thinking about how our river and this green space and this new transportation project are all going to intersect. How can the university help us? And then we've been able to deploy teams, which has been, again, a wide range of folks from across disciplines and across departments and across campuses, to help them have some of the capacity that especially the small communities don't have. And for me, that's really checked all these boxes of, it's our local partnerships, it's these public stakeholders, and it's really showing the value of the university and of our teams to the entire state, not just those primary agency partners.
Great, thanks. So one of CTS's greatest strengths has been its ability to bring people together, so across disciplines, agencies, and industries. How has that convening role evolved over time, and why does it remain so central to driving innovation today?
You ready?
I'll start.
Please.
Again, there's several examples. I'll choose the freight and logistics community, who came to us wanting us to do research on their issues. And we started meeting with them regularly. They felt that transportation studies ought to include freight, which they were right, but they were not about to put any funds towards research, thinking we should use our state funds to address that. So we did do some research, but more of an impact was producing this annual symposium, Freight and Logistics Symposium, which again, you were a key player. Just reading the Catalyst today, the kind of work you guys are doing in freight builds from that convening.
Right.
So the Freight and Logistics Forum had a planning committee out of the freight people, had their leaders as speakers. We would mix them with professors who are doing freight-related research. It's just a very, and it's also influenced MnDOT on its Freight Advisory Committee. So that took skill in facilitating. Event management became one of our core expertise areas, and it's continued to make impacts.
Yeah, Kyle and I were just reflecting on this year of freight as our shorthand for it, and it really has, I think, been appreciated by our stakeholders, our freight stakeholders, but I feel like we've also learned a lot through it, and actually have several ideas on how we're going to continue the work beyond 2025. So it's been but it really comes down to the relationships and the trust that you build through that, and MnDOT's trust in CTS to help guide also the work of the Minnesota Freight Advisory Committee. So we're a logistical partner. We provide support for that group. And it's, again, I think foundational and based on the relationships that we've built over the years. So really key.
Yep.
Well, building on that, I think another important foundational component of collaboration and connection is the CTS Executive Committee. And while that isn't on a specific topic, it's been absolutely critical to helping CTS maintain connection to the external environment, to become aware of threats and opportunities. And it's this diverse and has continued to grow to be more diverse over time group of leaders from around the state, the city, the region, public-private sector. So it covers all the bases. It really serves CTS well. Not only does it help us stay aware of threats and opportunities, but this group of people serve as incredible champions for CTS, and they do a great job of spreading the word about our value and our importance and our relevance, and I hope that continues.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Definitely.
Yeah, and I think the convening role to me is always a really important neutral body and sort of neutral territory that the university can present, right? We're not without our own biases and viewpoints, of course, but one of the things we often talk about in any of these conversations, sticking with the freight one, for example, is the university offering a venue to say, we did a cargo theft and fraud event earlier this year. I almost said today. Had a really busy day. Where, I think one of the big takeaways for us were that as many of those peer companies, as well as many of those peer companies get along, and they're often in national organizations, working on the same topics, trying to solve the same challenges, they're also competitors. And there is just very, very often just a recalcitrance to say, oh, I'm going to share this information, or I'm going to share this vulnerability, for lack of a better word, with their competitors, but then also sometimes with the regulators or the agencies, right? And so there's always a little bit of a tension of like, yes, this is a topic I want to talk about, but no, I don't want to talk about it in that setting, or with this focus, I want to frame it the way that I need to. And one of the things that I think often the university and CTS can provide in a lot of realms is just a space to say, we're calling this meeting. Like the university is curious about this question. We don't have any power over where your decision making is going or how your stockholders are responding or anything like that, but we've heard from you as stakeholders that this is a pertinent topic. We want to dig into that, and we want to present an opportunity for you all to come to a space where it isn't a respond to this regulation question or to this legislation or to whatever the problem of the day or the debate of the day is. And I think that is such an important convening role, whether it's a really controversial topic or a really timely topic or something that's one of these longer term, how do we talk about transportation and land use, right? It's a very different meeting if Metro Council calls it than if the university calls it. And Metro Council can come as a participant and share their perspective and talk about their work they're doing, but it's not under the auspice of whatever you might say here could end up in our plan over here. So I think that sometimes lowers the temperature, but also kind of creates an opportunity for let's dig into that even more. And to me, that's one of the things, the two of the words that I've been using a lot again, I think that are building on the strengths of the center are having people see us as being really proactive and being a really vital partner. And I think in both of those, the convening role is really critical because we want people to come to CTS and to the university and say, we need your help navigating this topic. We know you won't own it all, or we know you won't solve it all, but we want to start this discussion with you or have you help us navigate this thorny issue that we're dealing with. And I think we've done that throughout the history of the center, and I'm really struck from this conversation around some of the iterative and almost circular way that some of the topics come back up because they are so thorny, right? So land use and transportation, it's still a challenge, turns out. And we did a lot of great work in the early 2000s, and we built on it through Accessibility Observatory, and there's a whole slate of questions to keep asking about it. And it's more pressing now and more attentive. I think more people are paying attention to it than ever before. And so having some of the bona fides and having people see CTS as a group that has built and talked about this for decades, I think positions us in that topic and in many other examples to say, hey, we want to dig into this more and have partners come to us rather than us trying to pull them in and say, hey, we're still working on this, right? I think that's a huge impact of the convening, is to show people that we're here and want to be a part of the conversation.
And I think one of the items that is near and dear to my heart in this space is the Minnesota Towards Zero Deaths program. And it started back in 2001 when leaders at MnDOT and the Department of Public Safety came to CTS and said, we want to have a convening to talk about how do we move Minnesota toward zero deaths on our roads. And through that 2.5-day convening, where we brought together partners that had really never sat down together, everybody had their own area of focus with enforcement, engineering, EMS. Everyone had kind of their own piece of the pie, but they weren't connecting and talking together. And so that North Star, it was called North Star Safety Workshop, that really was the foundation for the Towards Zero Deaths program that is still going on today. And when I look back to see what our main action items were, some of them it took a little longer to create, but short term it was to pass 0.08 BAC and a primary seatbelt law. Those have been done. Create a statewide program that's going to coordinate safety activities across the state. That's been done. Create a leadership or an advisory council of transportation leaders to advise on traffic safety issues, and ACTS was created 4 or 5 years ago now. So it was a strong blueprint. And again, MnDOT and the Department of Public Safety came to CTS because they said, you're able to help us have these conversations because you don't have you don't have a particular perspective or point of view that you're trying to advance other than we all want our roads to be safer. So that's one of our most, I think, enduring examples of convening over the years.
I do think that research piece of it is really critical there too. I know we've already talked some about this, but I think, one of the lines that I draw for us, I'd be curious about your perspectives on this, y'all, when you were directors as well, is when we have the research that says seatbelts save lives, we know here's the data, we know the numbers. That's where I think it does cross into the university, and so CTS should be able and willing to say, great, we're going to share that with you. And again, it's in a very straightforward, legislative committee or advisory committee, you're asking for this information. I think one of the great strengths that we have is that we can draw on those research experts and their work and say, either we can answer that question for you if it's not there, like what are the main crash factors, or we can say this research is there, let us do this synthesis for you, let us talk to you about this legislation that you're considering, like here's what research shows, and sort of having the opportunity, the university to come and to share that, whether it's communicating through the Catalyst or at a legislative hearing, and say, here is what, whether it's the engineering science or policy researchers can show, also makes a huge difference, because I think it's, again, sort of that neutral reporting of here is what the work shows and what the data shows and what the conclusions are that can really help put a lot of the legislative next steps over.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. I remember it well. I mean, when we are convening, it's not necessarily situation where everybody is in agreement.
Right.
MnDOT and public safety aren't always in agreement. So our facilitating skills are important. But included in that North Star workshop were speeches by Australia,
Right.
Sweden, the state of Washington.
Right.
We were at a university setting. It's a learning process as well as just administering this event. And I think, and I tie that to the executive committee too, that they want to be associated with the university. And if we create this learning place, not only, they end up putting it on their resumes. So you did a great job building what we had.
Thank you.
In a much bigger executive committee, and it's continuing. When we first said we were going to do it, Dick Braun was worried that nobody was going to show up. But they did show up. They checked us out, and when it reached the level I thought it was really going to be a success was when I started seeing them showing up to be able to talk to each other, and we would have, the Met Council chair beckon to a legislator, could you come out in the hallway for a minute and interrupt, while we kept the meeting going. But it was that important forum for these leaders to learn from each other as well as learn from the university. So TZD is a great example.
Yeah. Yes. Well, let's switch gears a little bit because CTS has also played a powerful role in fueling talent by supporting students and also training professionals. So from your perspective, how has CTS helped prepare the next generation of transportation professionals, and how will that need change in the years ahead?
Well, I know there are several programs, and I think these guys are going to speak to some of the specific programs. I wanted to speak at a slightly more general level, harkening back to, again, some of that initial organizational structure that Bob and Dick put into place. And there we had the CTS councils. And those initially were intended and designed to bring together folks who had research needs with people who could provide research and help answer those needs. And as a newcomer to CTS and hired into the research management role, that was the most exciting place for me to be. I just love days when the CTS councils met. And part of that was because I was an engineer who secretly wanted a relationship job, and I landed it here. So thank you, Bob, for that opportunity. Beyond the research, how the councils has evolved really has become important in this knowledge transfer and training and education role. So now many of the council meetings are designed as a place to transfer knowledge that's coming out of research. And practitioners from public, private sector are there, and as well as other researchers and the like. So lots of knowledge is getting transferred through that particular structure and process. And it's a way for practitioners to keep their education and knowledge current.
Great. Bob?
Well, one thing I'll just say, a lot of people don't understand that research involves students.
Yes.
And we need to remember that every project that a faculty member is leading has 1, 2, or 3 graduate students who go on and become professionals or academics or whatever. So,
and increasingly undergraduate students. We're seeing more and more undergraduates participate in research as well.
So I wanted to make that point, but what I'll focus on here is another group of employees, local government maintenance people, technicians, who are keeping the system running. And the Local Technical Assistance Program provides that training. For many years, it's a federal program. When we were watching the legislation to get our base funding, I pushed to have words in there that CTS would also provide training for local government personnel. And it was a little delicate, that passed. It was delicate because North Dakota State University was providing the LTAP services to Minnesota, because when it began, the University of Minnesota said no, they couldn't do it. CTS could do it, and we eventually made that transition. And that funding allowed us to hire Sheree Marty, which was important in building that LTAP program, which really benefited CTS of being known, you were saying, around the state. I mean, every county uses LTAP.
Right.
So CTS name got out there. The Local Road Research Board provided matching funds. Great relationship developed with them, which I think still continues. Not only that, though, by hiring Cherie, we got a leader in education outreach that complemented Laurie leading in research management. And it was really the triangle of the three of us that built research, education, outreach programs and services in line with the university mission. So,
Yes, exactly.
but we did, I think, and still do influence the careers of technical people doing very important jobs maintaining the road systems out there.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think we've seen it become, not become, it has always been a major challenge for the state, again, at every level of workforce needs and making sure we have folks coming up the ranks of all of the examples, truck drivers, maintenance workers, plow drivers, engineers, engineering technicians. I think that all of the technical assistance programs that we run, I think we're in the 6,000 to 7,000 people a year in the various trainings through the various projects that we have, which is just really incredible. And one of the things that I think about too is, and that we've been working on recently with peers within the university and across the state, are how are we doing the whole education and training pipeline together? And CTS plays a huge role in a lot of that, and we're really working to be kind of a clearinghouse within the university to say, if you want to get exposed in kindergarten, well, we haven't figured out kindergarten quite yet, but if you want to get exposed in middle school, high school, we've got camps. You can do the NSTI, the Summer Transportation Institute, another federally supported program, or you can do our CAF camp, and we see those as not just interesting summer camps for Minnesotans all over to take advantage of, but actually an opportunity to say, hey, you're a rising junior or senior, you're starting to think about coming to the University of Minnesota, hopefully, but also what you want to do with your education and career. And here are ways that you might see a sector that you've never thought about, right? The NSTI camp in particular, I think they probably get exposed to 10, 15 different elements of transportation, right? Everything from the airport to advanced robotics research here at the university. And I think really just working hard to not see those as silos anymore. And that's one of the things that I've been reflecting on a lot with our local partners. We work a lot with state aid. We work a lot with the city and county engineers and with Local Road Research Board. And it's just so clear to me how much of a continuum and a need there is across all of that. And whether it's helping to show kids who are interested in trades and maintenance, hey, this is a great opportunity. Here's the types of training you would need to really advance in that career and secure that career. Or going all the way up to, hey, you want to get a PhD in this program and then have all of these opportunities either in academia or in agency or in industry. That's all one big pipeline, and I think our strength in the TAP programs has been that it continues as well, right? Once you're there, you don't stop learning. I love that part of the university mission of you don't just have to be here to be learning. We can come to you and help continue that, and I think it's just a great reflection, and it's changing so quickly. I think that was the other thing that I've really been reflecting on is drone technology or AI or autonomous vehicles and the ways that those intersect with what in some cases were not very quickly changing jobs, right? Like we've mentioned maintenance workers a few times. That the way they stay safe, the way they engage with the different machines, the way the different machines they're working with operate seems to change daily. And a big part of what we can do with the training and have always done is to say, hey, this is what you're going to need to know. Like here's how you might use a drone, or here's what you're going to be able to do with that drone, or here's what you need to be safe, how you need to be safe around a new giant electric charger. Have you thought about that yet? And that's just such a great opportunity for us to both help keep up with the innovation and keep our workforce strong and growing.
Well, let's look ahead a little bit now, because transportation really is in the midst of transportation or transformation. So we have automation, data, artificial intelligence, sustainability, equity are all kind of reshaping what the field of transportation looks like. So both how is CTS positioning itself to lead in this new landscape, and how should we be thinking about what's the future role of university transportation centers in supporting the industry and government partners and communities? And Kyle, maybe I'll turn to you to start.
Yeah, I think I started to touch on this a little bit, and I'd be really interested to hear, the lessons of how do we keep up with technology are kind of universal. So I'd love to hear examples. I'm excited to hear the examples you guys have from earlier, but I think the example I really want to highlight is the importance of continuing to widen our web of interdisciplinarity, and I'll use sort of machine learning, artificial intelligence, and just big data work generally as an example of a place that we need to explore. Again, we have some of that in-house. Our Accessibility Observatory team does great work with a range of that. But it is also true that the computer scientists and the geographers and the mathematicians and the folks who are doing a lot of this work, that they are often in categories where they would say, I don't work in transportation. I am working in machine learning and big data. There are obviously exceptions to that, and lots of people who do great work directly with that in transportation uses. But one of the things we've been really, I think, working towards is to say, who could we collaborate with in a topic that is really pertinent to transportation, that we can rely on their expertise, and they bring something totally new to the table that allows us to create a tool, like you were mentioning, that then permits an agency to say, oh, that's how I'm going to address that issue. The cargo theft example I gave before, we've been talking about how do we help bring all of this data into a single place where the university, again, as that neutral convener, could say, here are some outcomes, here are some things you should be thinking about. And that requires a bigger tent than CTS is usually built on with our campus partners to say, oh, who could build us, a web-based tool that can do that? Who understands how to build that infrastructure, build that data system together? Who can help us navigate all the privacy needs of that, right? And so I think that's, again, a huge testament to the strength of the university, that we can say, great, let's go work with the Supercomputing Institute, or let's find a computer scientist who can work with us on that. But I think that evolution and that ability to say, hey, this is something new. It's additive. It's a thing that we can focus on, but we got to find a wider audience, is a big part of how we can help kind of keep up with the technology changes and continue to inform the research and the outputs that help those agencies and public respond to the changes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what I would add to that, and it's really just building and repeating in some sense, but I think an important way for CTS to position itself to remain a leader is to be always on the lookout for the right talent. And that, I think the talent here at a university needs to be curious, and it needs to be visionary, okay? I don't consider myself much of a visionary, but I consider one of my strengths to be able to recognize it. And that, you need a lot of people on a team. A team from CTS needs to have the talent that's going to skate to the puck before they know where it's going, or when they, anticipate where it's going. So the anticipation part of adapting to change, I think that's the word that we don't want to lose track of. You want to be anticipating and try to get yourself positioned with the right talent and expand it. All those things that you said, just to me, the word that kind of summed that up was talent. Have the curious, innovative, visionary talent that can help you get there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I agree with what you both have said. It can get a little complicated because what can accelerate exploration is a little funding. And I remember one time when structures faculty in civil engineering were not satisfied with the funding that they were getting for bridge research. And I remember discussions with MnDOT, they don't have to do bridge research. They're starting to submit NIH proposals to do structure of teeth and bones research and look at the same properties, same academic breakthroughs. So if CTS can retain some seed funding, or particularly attract funding on some of these new big issues, it can go a long way in getting faculty committed, getting a student assigned, and then build exactly as you're saying it. Because I mean, the university, with its learning capabilities, people pay attention I think they want CTS to be sort of neutral, not partisan or anything. And so many examples that we've already talked about are success stories there. As these new issues come in, continuing that, being a trusted resource, defining the questions around the new issue, providing information, that same process that's been working for several years, I think, applies to all these new issues as well.
The only thing that I would add where I feel like we are being more intentional is around seeking and proactively looking at opportunities to collaborate and partner with other universities. So, when the game changed at the federal level, consortia of universities were encouraged. And in order to be successful, it can't just be we're going to get together for the sake of this proposal, but you really need to build meaningful partnerships that are going to go beyond one project. And so I think that's an area that we're looking to focus on.
Yeah, I would say too what you both mentioned, words I was going to pull up, which is relationships and partnerships, and I think that is a really important way to navigate the transformation of the field and the new areas as well. And one of the things we've talked about with all of our researchers just this past week is the relationships we build with, again, every level of local agency, regional, state, national opportunities, our university collaborators and peers as well, allows us to say, like, that's where you explore those, I didn't really realize, I'm going to keep picking on computer science. I guess I'm elevating computer science, not picking on them. Like, we've tried to do a couple different of those kind of collision meetings where it's like, hey, transportation engineering folks, there might be a really great there with this conversation with a Humphrey professor or the medical school, or how do we bring those fields together? And I think that is also really applicable to those public relationships and the public partnerships that we have, where it's really like, how do I help translate where AI fits in for a county engineer? If you're talking it again from that academic perspective of here's how I've been working with it, I'm thinking about it every day, here's the project I'm putting together, you still have to go and say, this is why this matters, right? Here's why, Bridge Office, you should think about this method. Because that is, all of us in our day jobs, even if it is at CTS, don't have enough attention to be like, oh yes, I'm gonna read every one of the research reports that come out in this space, and I'm gonna stay up on that. And that's what the researchers are, right? And that's what their students are. And so when they're putting those questions together, I think that opportunity to then also deliver that through a relationship you've developed with those local partners, and that's where I think this two-way hub of CTS is so critical, is to say, hey, you should talk to this researcher whose expertise is this, and even though you never thought that biological process might have some influence on your material, here it is, and let's explore that, and let's see how we can use that to our collective advantage. I think that's going to be critical as things continue to change so fast too, because even though the pace of academia can be slow, a lot of the folks are working on such foundational stuff that when they're able to share it, it's cutting edge for many of those public partners who are just trying to stay ahead of what are we doing today? How are we plowing these roads today, right? And not having the chance to be like, great, I'm ready to apply that new technology as well.
So each of you has guided CTS through growth and challenges. So what would you say your leadership lessons that you've learned, that you have experienced, and what has stayed with you following your tenure or during your tenure at CTS?
Okay.
You want to start?
I would love to. I will first talk about being nimble, and that relates to my prior stories about the changing environment as I entered my directorship and needing to really be looking at securing our funding in different ways. And so being nimble involved finding and cementing some partnerships with key faculty who could take a leadership role in pursuing federal funding. So we had a lot of fun with that, and some of those opportunities soared and some kind of drifted to the wayside, and that's not surprising. But being nimble, so I think that's a really important lesson, stay nimble and stay relevant. So that is, the impacts, keep a focus on impacts so that your partners and your communities and your interested parties will always believe you're important and need to be around, so relevance. And then the last thing I wanted to say is find a way to yes. And I can't take credit for that phrase, but I really found it important and valuable, because you will run into a lot of people who will say no, that you can't do it, no. But you can find a way to yes and just keep plugging away.
Great, thanks, Laurie. Bob?
Yeah, I think what I learned was the value of taking a risk. I mean, when I was offered that job in 1988, there was really nothing except some money. There's no organizational structure. You have to figure out what the university, how to integrate. This threat of funding going away after 4 years is looming.
Right.
So to jump in and take a risk, have faith, we can make this go beyond 4 years. That was a lesson learned that I think served me well when I went on to lead the Volpe Center in Massachusetts with all the federal dynamics. So some things don't work.
Right.
And I mean, I remember when we decided we're going to have an annual research conference, and Dick said, "Annual? Are you? We're going to name it annual. We're going to do it forever." And that one paid off. I remember we worked a lot on a certificate program. It didn't work. But we kept trying things and seeing what sticks. So that was my lesson, I think.
All right, great. Kyle, how about for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think so much of what I try to cultivate as a leader, and then what I've learned from predecessors and other mentors and colleagues in my life is just really, like, you have to trust the team. Like I've mentioned several times, I think it's right there behind your head, Laurie. You got excellence right there. This is a really an incredible organization with incredible individuals and professionals working in it, and I think a lot of it has been like not necessarily staying out of the way, but like how do you support and help empower the folks who are working on the projects that they know way better than I will ever know. Like it doesn't matter how many times our LTAP team gives me updates about all the things that they're doing in LTAP, I will never know that as intimately as they do. I won't have the same level of relationships. And so a lot of what I've tried to do is just to say, great, like it seems like that's going well. There's problem solving to help with, and there's like platforms to create to help build on that. I think what I would echo Bob, and a lot of what I think about is just how do we also kind of set expectations and not like rest on our laurels, right? So if we're doing things really well, what are the things that we can add on top of that, as I was saying before, right? Like this increment of where's all the stuff that we can grow, and how do we build on it, and how do we take risks and identify sort of those paths you were talking about, right? Like how do you help identify this is the moment to do this, and there's an opportunity to do this, and it's worth exploring doing that. And I would also say, like, we have the benefit now, again, of building on all this hard work of the previous 35 years, in my case, of we have an ability to take risks, and we have the opportunity to say we have these resources available. How do we strengthen the MenCav ecosystem? What investments can we continue to make? How do we support researchers across the university with seed grants? How do we build partnerships that bear fruit in ways that we don't expect? And what other paths can we build that don't currently exist, like the Empowering Small Minnesota Communities as an example of, like, it would have been really easy to say no to that, right? Like, infrastructure is way too broad. We just do transportation. Why would But one of the things that I would say the CTS team brings to that project is our organizational excellence and our ability to say, great, lots of moving pieces in this. How do we help that stay together, and how do we help move that forward, and how do we allow those other partners who do such great work in that space and others to really thrive? And so I think that's kind of the, like, on the individual and the institutional side. For my drumbeat is like, let's not just we can keep doing a lot of what we've always done, which is great. And also, let's not just do that, right? Like, how do we think about what comes next, and how do we iterate from what we've always done?
Great. Well, those are all wonderful lessons and very relevant to how we're continuing to move ahead at CTS today.
Well, Gina, this is a chance for you to share how you see leadership also, because you've been a leader here for as many years as we've all been around. So.
Well, that's hard because I haven't thought about it that much.
I'm sorry, I apologize for that.
But I would say from my perspective is I've had great mentors in all three of you in my career path. So being a mentor in both big and small ways to staff, and just again the importance of hiring good people, recognizing you may not keep them for as long as you would like, but while they're here, really give them those opportunities themselves to grow and develop. And it will come back to you in unexpected ways. So we have a number of staff who have left CTS but are still working within transportation and are great ambassadors for CTS. So to me, that's always been that's important. So finally, my final question, in one word or short phrase, I don't know if we can do short phrase with this group, we'll try. How would you describe the spirit of CTS both in past, present, and future?
Well, I would start with the word innovation.
Okay.
CTS is trying to use research to innovate in the field of transportation, but CTS is also innovative in itself, particularly in its outreach programs. So just seeing what you guys have accomplished in recent years with social media is really impressive to me. So providing information, convening, facilitation, trying to define those questions in the future with a goal of producing innovation that affects society in positive ways. That's how I would see what CTS has been doing and what it should keep doing.
Great. Thanks, Bob. Laurie?
Resilient. To me, that is the CTS spirit, resilient, because there has been adversity, there will continue to be adversity, and the CTS has always shined through that. And nimble, because to be resilient, you need to be nimble too.
Yeah.
I don't know what you're talking about. It's always smooth sailing. You never have any
Well, that's why I was looking at the future. I don't think I think you've sailed along. You're doing great. You're doing great.
I would come back to what I've said multiple times. I think the collaboration and partnership work that we do is so central to who we are and so central to our role within the university and the broader external ecosystem that we operate in as well. And is what it makes it easy for me to then seek for us to be proactive and vital, to have people coming to us and saying, hey, we want to partner with you, hey, we want your help on this. It's because it's rooted in that that very core part of our collective work, and I think it has been core to its entire existence, is to say we're here to facilitate this, we're here to collaborate and to identify these opportunities. And I think that's a very clear through line for all 40 years.
And I would say the spirit of CTS is our talented staff. So, we wouldn't have made it to 40 without all those folks, both past, present, and hopefully future.
Right.
So I think that's...
Well, speaking of Gina's leadership, do you remember we first met Gina when she was a staff person for Senator Durenberger? And she was intrigued with us, so we invited her to be on our Information Outreach Council.
That's right, yes.
And she was very active on that council. And I said, we need to get her. And then we had this opening with the Transportation Regional Growth Study.
I know. And the rest is history.
That's right.
28 years of it, Bob.
That's right.
Well, thank you, Kyle, Laurie, and Bob, for sharing your reflections with us today. And thank you to everyone who has contributed to CTS over the past 40 years. And together, we've all helped make Minnesota and transportation stronger, safer, and more connected for the decades ahead. So thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Gina.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, guys.